Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Thank you for joining me. Today's episode is called UFOs in Antarctica, 12 True Cases. Some of you have may already seen my episode about UFOs in the Arctic, 24 cases. Please don't confuse these two locations, they're very different. Antarctica is of course located in the South Pole. And yeah, I wanted to do some real deep research into this particular location because the number of conspiracies and wild speculations about this area are off the charts. So it really took me some time to sort of sift through all that and get to the truth of what's going on there in regards to UFOs. But I did find at least 12 very well authenticated cases. That's what I want to talk about today. But before I dive into the actual cases, let me tell you a little bit about this very strange and unique location on our planet. You may not be aware of this, but the Antarctic is the coldest, windiest, driest, highest, and most remote location on this planet. There's some very interesting things about it. Nobody actually owns Antarctica. In fact, in 1959, some 12 countries agreed to abide by the so-called Antarctic Treaty. And this holds that nobody owns the area, but it will be reserved for scientific, peaceful research. At least 7 countries have made territorial claims, including Argentina, Australia, Chile, France, New Zealand, Norway, the UK, and of course the United States. These are not really internationally recognized, but these countries have maintained bases there on a fairly regular basis. Now the population in Antarctica, as you might expect, is quite small. It ranges anywhere from 1,000 to 5,000 people at any given time. Interestingly, 11 babies have been born there. There have been quite a few deaths, 1 murder as far as I know of. Now here's a really interesting fact about Antarctica. It contains somewhere between 60 to 90% of the world's fresh water. That's a lot. And it's very cold there, like I said, the coldest place on Earth, with an average temperature somewhere in the neighborhood of minus 76 degrees Fahrenheit. That's cold. It is covered by a huge ice sheet, which is about 3 miles thick. It's actually now a tourist destination. Some 40,000 tourists visit there each year. It is the 5th largest continent, contains about 5.5 million square miles, 90% of which is covered with ice. Again, 0 permanent residents. It has 6 months of constant day alternated with 6 months of constant night. And here's another interesting fact. When you stand at the South Pole, every single direction you point to is north. So, I mean, that seems obvious, but it's still kind of interesting. There's not much wildlife there. Really, the only major wildlife are penguins, seals, whales. There are no polar bears in Antarctica. And of course, all kinds of wild conspiracies, as I mentioned. Admiral Byrd and his claims or, rumors of there being an entrance to the hollow earth, which I frankly don't find credible, but also rumors of a secret Nazi base, lost cities, I mean, you name it. People have speculated about the Antarctica for a long, long time. So again, I'm just going to confine this episode to cases that I think are pretty well authenticated. There's 1 or 2 that might be a little bit dubious, but most of them are really well authenticated, very well documented, and extremely important, actually. I mean, a couple of these cases might be some of my favorite that I've ever looked into. So this includes mostly sightings, but apparent landing and a humanoid, a possible UFO crash. That is the dubious one, as you might expect. But I think you'll find this super fascinating. There's so much speculation about what's going on there. It should be interesting to see, what we can actually verify. So let's start with the first really well-documented early case, which I call "We have photographs to prove what we saw." This occurred on February 23rd, 1948 at the base of Arthur Pratt, and this is like just a few months before the modern age of ufology, which really began in July of 1947. So that alone makes this a pretty important case, but as we get into it, I think you'll find it really quite astonishing. It was during an expedition to the Chilean Antarctic base of Arturo Prat on February 23, 1948, that Captain Augusto Vars Orrego of the Chilean Navy said that, and I quote, "During the bright Antarctic night, we saw flying saucers, one above the other, turning at tremendous speeds. We have photographs to prove what we saw." Now, in another statement to reporters, he said, "I don't think that this was an optical illusion. We have corroboration of what we saw from photographs taken of the phenomenon." Now, according to some sources, it wasn't just photographs that they took, but actual videos. We don't have a whole lot of information other than this. Donald Kehoe heard about this case, and he said, and again I quote, "Later, when I requested copies from the Chilean embassy in Washington, I was told the pictures were classified." But get this, in a direct letter to the Chilean Navy itself, this message was received in response. It says, and I quote, "We are pleased to acknowledge the receipt of your letter regarding the photographs showing UFOs in formational flight, which you mention were taken by Captain Orrego of the Chilean Navy near Antarctica in 1948. Regarding this matter, we wish to inform you that recently we received a communication from Captain Orrego stating that he had not seen any UFOs over the Antarctica in 1948. Therefore, the photographs requested by you do not exist. Signed, Harold Nagel, Captain Chief of the Chilean Naval Mission." So there you go. That's all we know about this first case in Antarctica. So there you have it, a large group of trained military observers not only seeing UFOs but photographing them. And what happens? These photographs are covered up, never released, never happened according to authorities. So the cover-up was in place very early on. And here's another case that speaks to that. This is such an amazing case. I can't believe this one is not more well known. I call this next case "The Cold Scrutiny of Unknown Eyes." This occurred on January 8, 1956 at Robertson Island, of course in the Antarctic. This is such an important case. I think it has a lot to say about UFOs. It's very well documented and not relying simply on eyewitness testimony, because in this case, as in a good number of these cases, there is scientific instrumentation verifying the presence of these unknown objects. There are 4 witnesses to this case, all Chilean scientists. Their names are Celestino Castro, Abelardo Baez, Jorge Moder, and Juan Adofaci. They were all stationed at the foot of a glacier located on the tiny and remote Robertson Island in the Weddell Sea of Antarctica. This is about 13 miles long, 6 miles wide, and they were there in order to make scientific observations. Now, the first strange event, which occurred on January 8, 1956, was the unexplained failure of the camp radio, which, considering what happened next, the scientists believe this is significant. It was at this time the sun was never completely setting. This was affecting all of their sleeping habits. 2 of the men, Celestino and Jorge, shared a tent, and around 7 a.m., Celestino stepped out of his tent and saw a metallic object hovering overhead. The sky was perfectly clear at this time. The temperature was about 15 to 20 degrees below zero, so he immediately woke up Jorge and insisted that he come outside. The 2 men saw 2 metallic, cigar-shaped objects hovering in a vertical position straight overhead. And as one of the witnesses says, the things looked utterly solid, with smooth, polished, seemingly metallic surfaces. So another one of the witnesses was Abelardo Baez. You can see him here. He recently granted an extensive interview about what happened, and as he says, there were two zeppelins, like pencils, with that shape, which were vertically in the sky and did not move, static in the air. They had no windows. You could see violet, purple, and silver color changes. It was something impressive. I didn't feel scared, but rather I was asking myself questions as to what this was all about. Jorge Motor went crazy. He went back inside the shelter to make certain measurements. He brought an altimeter, which for me, a layman, was something spectacular. With that, he measured the height of the object. It was practically 150 meters long, 450 feet, so that's pretty big. So wondering if this was a trick of the atmosphere, the four men moved to another position, but still the objects remained in the sky. One was slightly higher than the other, so all four of them watched in amazement for the next 2 hours. And it was during this time they took numerous photographs, both in color and in black and white film. After about 2 hours of observation, the higher object moved to a horizontal position and began to glow and flash multicolored lights. Then, as if intentionally putting on a display for the four scientists, it began to perform a series of fantastic maneuvers, doing instant accelerations, zigzagging across the sky, coming to a complete stop, turning at 90-degree angles. It did this for about 5 minutes, then resumed its original vertical position. But then the second craft did the same darn thing, flashing colors and cavorting around the sky, doing about 10 maneuvers for a period of 3 minutes. Both of these were done in perfect silence. But during this time, the Geiger counter that they had on site became activated and indicated a radiation exposure some 40 times greater than normal. So all four of the men, as you can imagine, were very much impressed by the movement of these objects. And as Abelardo Baez says, the objects began to make some movements at a speed that was calculated at 45,000 kilometers per hour. They moved in zigzag and then stopped dead in their tracks. Human beings at that speed inside those objects would be crushed by inertia. That meant to him, meaning Jorge Motor, that they were not beings of this planet. So at this point they realized that they were seeing genuine UFOs and became quite concerned about it. Being in such a remote area with such a hostile climate, they had no means of escape or protection. The four men felt certain that the UFO occupants were there for them, as there was nothing else in this area. They felt that they were being, quote, subjected to the cold scrutiny of unknown and unknowable eyes. Now Jorge said that being the object of attention from a, quote, such superior technology was anything but soothing. Now these objects stayed there for an incredibly long time. They remained overhead for the entire day and into the night. When night arrived, the men were too concerned by the presence of the objects to even attempt to go to sleep, and these objects remained there through the night and into the next day. By late afternoon of the second day, some cirrus clouds moved overhead. Jorge began to use a theodolite, and he estimated that the two cigar-shaped craft were about 24,000 feet overhead, which again meant that they were some 450 feet long and 75 feet in diameter. Celestino used binoculars to view the objects, and he saw what looked like a hatchway on one of them. Finally, to sort of provoke a response, Jorge decided to take a mirror with a polarized lens, and he pointed it at the upper object, flashing it. Immediately, as if in response, the object flashed an intensely bright light and dropped to a much lower altitude. And as it moved lower, Celestino became upset. In fact, he became upset to such a degree that he kicked this device and broke it. As Abelardo says, Celestino Castro got very upset. He got scared. He hit it with a stick and broke the mirror so that the objects would not continue to approach. Because as he communicated, the objects came a little closer. Celestino was afraid that if they kept coming closer and the radioactivity kept increasing, we would all die. So yeah, this did provoke a fear response from at least Celestino. Abelardo says that he and the other two men experienced no fear, but Celestino, who he describes as, quote, a very wise old man, an extraordinary man, was for some reason very much affected. As Abelardo says, he went into a state of anguish, of panic. So, after several long tense moments, the objects rose up back to their original positions and performed this incredible sky dance, darting across the sky with extreme speeds. Eventually the clouds rolled in and obscured the objects from view. It was around 2 a.m. that the Geiger counter stopped flashing, which indicated to the men that the objects had likely left. And a few hours later, when the clouds cleared, the objects were, as they suspected, now gone. But the four men were then picked up by their country on January 20th. They were reluctant at first to speak about what happened, but finally agreed to tell a high-ranking officer. And this had some consequences. As Abelardo says, the Commodore, the captain who was in charge of the whole expedition, strictly forbade us to comment anything. Otherwise, we would have to assume the consequences. Now, despite this, one of the witnesses, Jorge Motor, did agree to a television interview, but only if his face was not shown. And it was many decades later that Abelardo Baez did agree to a lengthy interview. Unfortunately, the photographs that were taken of this incident have never been released. Man, oh man, what I would do to get my hands on those photographs must be amazing. They're somewhere. Hopefully, at some point, this ridiculous UFO cover-up will end, and we can get access to all of this documentation and photographs about all of these cases. Because really, it's time. Why this subject continues to be covered up is beyond me to some extent. I mean, we know why, but I think it really needs to end. Now, here's another super interesting case. This is the only well-verified case I could find of a humanoid in the Antarctic, but it's a pretty darn interesting case. I call this one, I'm ashamed to say I panicked. That is, of course, a direct quote by the witness himself. This occurred on December 11, 1958, at the very famous McMurdo Station in Antarctica. This one is amazing. This incredible account comes from researcher Yvonne S. Durfield, who published the story in Ideal UFO magazine, issue number 2. There's only one witness, a Navy officer by the name of Roger D. Benson. He was 30 years old at the time, stationed at McMurdo Base, which is in the shadow of Mount Erebus. Roger D. Benson was an AQI, an Aviation Fire Control Technician Petty Officer. So part of his duties included transporting waste. And it was on December 11, 1958. It was a warm day for Antarctica, 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Roger was driving a W-11 Weasel truck vehicle transporting waste off of the base when he noticed a strange object in the distance. And I'll just quote him directly. As he said, "There shouldn't be anything there. I was curious. I radioed that I was getting out of my vehicle, jumped out onto the ice, and took a closer look. At first, I thought I was looking at some object made up of girders, like a tower observation or a gigantic radar antenna. I looked through the binoculars. I was seeing what resembled a side view of an airplane fuselage, and the beams were a network of support structures like a gear train landing. This, quote, fuselage was a cigar-shaped metal capsule with a small indentation that could have been a door. This whole thing seemed to be about 500 yards from me, which would make the object the same size as a DC Airplane 3. Although I am completely familiar with aircraft, that was not any plane that belonged to us or the Russians. Then I saw the creature." So this strange craft was parked on the ice with large landing legs, he says, and the creature Roger says he saw was walking beneath it, was walking in slow circles around the base of the craft, and he could clearly see that it was not any normal human being. As Roger says, the being was very thin and grayish in color. Its arms were swinging as it walked on the ice. From a distance I couldn't be sure, but it seemed to have human-like facial features, except that the face consumed almost 2/3 of its body at full height. I'm ashamed to say now that I did exactly what I shouldn't have, contrary to the training I received. I panicked. I climbed into my vehicle, went back to the base, and screamed into the radio. After a few seconds, I controlled myself to look back. The fuselage capsule, minus the beam-shaped landing gear, which could have been retracted, was now rising into the air. I stopped long enough to see the thing fly away, presumably with that strange creature inside. So Roger was apparently afraid of ridicule and disbelief and did not report his sighting to his superiors. He did learn something interesting, however. He learned that his second panicked radio transmission was never received. He did report his sighting to his friends, and later, of course, to researcher Yvonne Durfield. But as it turns out, a lot of sightings were occurring at this time. As Yvonne Durfield writes, and I quote, "As Operation Deep Freeze spread across the Antarctic in 1957 and 1958, radar trackings of UFOs became almost commonplace." And she's not the only person saying that. PHI Stephen B. Buggs, a member of Deep Freeze, later wrote, "We were getting radar tracking, which were confirmed by operators at 3 or 4 different locations on the air and ground. There was absolutely no doubt that real UFOs were being observed regularly and frequently." And in fact, only 2 months earlier, Dr. Yuri I. Danikov, a leading Russian glacier expert stationed at Vostok near the South Geometric Pole, wrote that he and his fellow scientists were, quote, "pestered by a low-flying disk. As he says, it was like a flat stone, but apparently made of steel, and it moved in total silence. It flew over us, and then made another pass at lower altitude. We had an eerie feeling, not only that we were being watched, but that some force was attempting to communicate with us. I remember a stirring in my mind. I am absolutely convinced this was a Voyager from the cosmos." So it sounds like he's describing telepathy. Now, this was again during Operation Deep Freeze, which Roger D. Benson says he was a part of. It was led by U.S. Rear Admiral George J. Dufek, who you can see here. And he later gave an interview which certainly raised eyebrows when he said, and I quote, "I believe in UFOs. I think that the existence of flying saucers cannot be discounted. Reports of meteors probably were saucers driven from Venus or other planets by intelligent beings." How incredible is that? I tried so hard to locate the first-hand witness, Roger Benson. I could not do it. And yeah, it is a single witness case, but given all those sightings going around that area at that time, I think that provides a level of corroboration to what Mr. Benson says he saw. Again, you can make up your own minds about it. I'm just reporting the facts as we know them. And I think that's an important and amazing case. And here's another one. Definitely UFOs are showing an interest in Antarctica, as this next case shows, which I call a polished gold surface. This occurred on June 7, 1962 at Hallett Station in Antarctica. And another amazing case of a UFO seen by trained military scientist observers. Navy scientists were at Hallett Research Station on June 7, 1962, when their attention was drawn to a brilliant white light, which they said was 20 times brighter than the brightest star in the sky. They watched this thing move across the sky, low on the horizon, and then stop directly between 2 mountain peaks. They used binoculars to view this object and could now see that it was circular, with a dazzling gold color, which they said was similar to the sun's reflection off of a polished gold surface. Now, at the time of this sighting, the sun was actually below the horizon. And after about 5 minutes, this glowing object moved to the south behind one of the peaks and did not come out the other side as it should have. This is when Project Blue Book investigated, and they had to use mental acrobatics and blamed the scientists, get this, for mistaking the object for Jupiter, apparently ignoring the fact that this object had a polished gold surface, moved across the sky, stopped, and then moved again, not to mention the fact that these were trained observers and that Jupiter had already set below the horizon. Nevertheless, Blue Book writes, it is probable that a strong inversion was present in the area at the time of the sighting and that strange effects associated with this condition contributed to the sighting. There were a few other sightings around that time. 2 weeks later, on June 22nd, 1962, there was a 2-second long sighting of a brilliant object zipping across the sky, leaving a vapor trail. This was observed from Detachment Alpha. Blue Book heard about this one and concluded that this was a meteor, which certainly seems possible. 2 weeks after this, on July 7th, 1962, a man was on the roof of the building when he saw a brilliant light which he first thought was a flare. He said it was as large as a basketball and it had 2 smaller, dimmer lights. All 3 moved across the sky from southwest to northwest. This was labeled as a bolide. Now, these last 2 sightings may have been due to, as Blue Book says, quote, natural causes. But the first sighting on June 7 absolutely seems genuine. Researchers who looked into Blue Book's conclusions called them, quote, bogus and inconsistent, and pointed out that if it had in fact been Jupiter, it would have been seen on succeeding nights, which of course it was not. How about that? Amazing. What's even more amazing is how military intelligence Project Blue Book does backbends and incredible mental gymnastics to try to explain these cases away. Honestly, saying that these scientists observed Jupiter when they know full well what Jupiter looks like. And again, as someone else noted, it would have been seen there on a nightly basis and was just seen there the one time, so don't know what they're trying to make us believe with these ridiculous explanations. It really only goes to show how faulty they are in their attempts to discredit this sighting and this subject in general. So now let's move to the next case, which is a really important one. And this one is very interesting, which I call UFO Investigates Nuclear Test. Look this date up, July 9, 1962. I think you'll find it fascinating what happened on that day, where a nuclear bomb was launched and caused some very strange effects, which I'll get into in just a second. As part of what came to be known as Operation Starfish Prime, on July 9, 1962, the United States detonated a 1.45 megaton hydrogen bomb in space 250 miles above Johnson Atoll. Now, this is 100 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima and was in fact the largest nuclear test in outer space. It knocked several satellites out. It created a power surge which impacted the electrical grid on the Hawaiian Islands, actually destroying more than 300 streetlights on the island of Oahu. This massive explosion sent out a powerful EMP, an electromagnetic pulse, which created a widespread aurora throughout the Pacific. It reportedly expelled Earth's magnetic field for a period of 30 full seconds. Now, important here is what happened following this explosion. A massive UFO appeared over Antarctica. Dr. Hellard and 7 other members of his party observed an object that they described as a shining light, circular in shape. This object was in view for about 1 minute as it passed from south to northeast. As it moved overhead, they took color photographs of this object. Speaking later to reporters, Dr. Hellard described the UFO as completely alien in design and performance to any known phenomena and relative to this Earth. The members of the team knew about the explosion over Johnson Atoll, as the aurora was clearly visible from their location. They thought it significant that the object they observed was heading on a straight course directly for the location of this explosion. Very strange. And while that nuclear test wasn't done anywhere near Antarctica, witnesses there apparently saw a UFO heading for that area. So I can't say for sure that those 2 events are directly connected, but knowing that UFOs express an incredible interest in anything nuclear, I think it's safe to say that they certainly knew about it. and the fact that it occurred moments before or around the same time as this nuclear test also, I think, argues for there being a connection there. And now we get to what is absolutely my favorite case in this episode, and perhaps one of my favorite cases I've ever heard about. I mean, this one's so astonishing on multiple levels. I absolutely love this case because of the aftermath, mostly of what happened here, but all throughout it, I mean, it is amazing. I call this one UFO Takes Control of Aircraft. And not in a bad way, I don't think. I think actually, as we'll see in this case, these UFOs were rescuing this aircraft from what appeared to be imminent disaster. This occurred on April 20, 1964, near McMurdo Station in the Antarctic. And wow, I mean, just listen, stay tuned, because this one is amazing. It was early on the morning of April 20, 1964, as 6 members of a USO Coast Guard aircraft were flying to McMurdo Naval Air Station in a C-130 turboprop transport aircraft filled with supplies for the base. They were at about 35,000 feet altitude when one of the men looked out the right side of the plane and was shocked to see 9 glowing white objects approaching their aircraft in a V formation at an estimated speed of about 400 knots. In mere moments, these objects were flying right alongside the plane on the right side, slowing their pace to match the speed of the C-130. After just a few moments, these objects rose upward and took position on the left side of the plane. Now, these objects were not visible on the plane's radar. The pilot attempted to communicate by radio, but discovered that the radio was not working. Also, the plane's radar stopped functioning. Now, it appears that the plane was in distress because it was around this time that the engines stopped functioning, apparently due to the oil freezing from the very, very low temperatures. The pilot tried to switch to auxiliary power and discovered that this also was not functioning. Now, even though the engines were not actually running at this time, the aircraft maintained a, quote, steady altitude and course, which is really quite strange. It should have dropped like a rock, they thought. But the plane was flying in perfect silence, apparently with the assistance of the UFOs, or so believed the crew. The pilot was unable to steer the plane at all. He could not make it go up, down, left, or right. It appeared as if someone else, clearly the UFO occupants, had taken control of the C-130. Things became even more strange when they began to enter a, quote, strange haze, causing a complete whiteout. Now, this can be very dangerous. In a previous incident, Colonel Joseph Dobratz, he was well known for flying these C-130s in McMurdo at this time. In fact, he could very well be the pilot on this flight, though I was not able to confirm this. But again, on a previous incident, Colonel Joseph Dobratz described how they had entered a cloud and it coated the plane with ice and they were barely able to land. So this is a very concerning situation as this C-130 enters this, quote, strange haze. And it was strange because immediately when they flew into this cloud, the air became filled with static electricity, which actually started to cause arcing inside the aircraft itself. The passengers who got too close to the fuselage actually found themselves getting shocked. And it was during this time that crew members managed to take no less than 9 rolls of photographs of these glowing objects next to their plane. Now, after about 20 minutes, this haze vanished, the power suddenly returned, and the crew were immediately able to restart the engines. All of their equipment functioned normally, the radar, the radio, all of it. Now, this flight had covered a distance of some 265 nautical miles over a period of 50 minutes from the moment the UFOs appeared to when they departed. And this did not make sense, as the plane had been traveling only about 160 to 190 knots per hour. So in other words, the appearance of the UFO had shortened their travel time by almost an hour. Finally, they landed at McMurdo, and the crew members excitedly discussed their incredible UFO encounter among themselves and later to their superiors. They turned in 7 of the 9 rolls of film to their superiors, keeping 2 of them. But they also discovered some other strange details. It was then that they realized that the C-130 still had far more fuel on board than it should have, which confirmed that some 265 miles were flown with the aircraft engines off and not consuming fuel. Then came the most astounding and incredibly strange detail of this event. As they began to unload the equipment and the supplies from the C-130, much of the material weighed far less than it should. It had been reduced in weight. As one of the crew members later told researchers, if you had a metal chain that should weigh 1 pound, it now weighed a ½ pound. So it appeared that the objects made of iron or steel were the most affected, while the metal items made of aluminum and other alloys did not appear to be affected. But they all lost weight. In fact, the most dramatic example of this were the 2 heavy D-18 tractors, which weighed far less than they should have and were easily unloaded because they were half their normal weight. So following this incident, all 6 crew members were questioned for a period of no less than 2 days about what happened. Some of the questioners were naval intelligence officers. All of the crew members of the C-130 were told in no uncertain terms to keep their mouths shut about the incident. Now, the crew member who had turned over the 7 rolls of footage to his superiors and saved 2 rolls for himself had his 2 rolls of film developed, only to discover that the film was completely fogged, as if exposed to some kind of radiation. Not one of his photos came out. And he later learned that the other 7 rolls given to his superiors suffered the same fate. Now, incidentally, this is a tangent, it was only 4 days later that one of the most famous UFO incidents in U.S. history occurred. The April 24, 1964 landing at Socorro, New Mexico, which was witnessed by police officer Lonnie Zamora. But meanwhile, back at McMurdo, one of the crewmen states that 9 months later, on January 3, 1965, he was a crew member of another C-130 flight about 100 miles from the location of the earlier encounter, when suddenly the C-130 lost all power, including secondary power and also radio. Crew members actually began to prepare to parachute from the craft when suddenly, quote, an elongated, glowing, tear-shaped object passed by the plane, making a, quote, hell of a bang. The C-130 slipped into the wash left behind and was buffed around. This craft that was by them, they said it glowed gold and light blue and left a vapor trail. One of the crew members did manage to take 7 rolls of film. He said this thing was larger than the C-130. 3 minutes later, the power on the plane was mysteriously restored. So perhaps this is another incident where the UFO is helping the plane somehow. Hard to say for sure. But they radioed the base to see if they had any other aircraft on radar and were told no. Upon landing, the film was turned over to the Navy. Reportedly, the film did show the objects in perfect clarity. But once again, we never got to see these photos. Another case that's really undeniable. Well, more than one case as you've seen. Love to get a hold of those photographs, the ones that turned out. Man, oh man, that case of these UFOs next to that plane, and afterwards, them unloading the equipment and realizing it had been reduced in weight significantly. I think that's a very important detail, which has a lot to say about how gravity is connected to electromagnetism. This is the kind of case that really offers us an opportunity to learn more about this universe we live in. Such an important case on multiple levels. Now let's move to another case which is absolutely undeniable, because this is not just one sighting or 2 or 3 or 4, but a dozen over a very short period of time. This is clearly some kind of display, with the UFO occupants wanting us to know that they are absolutely aware of what we're doing down in Antarctica. I call this one UFO Wave over Deception Island. This occurred through June and July of 1965 again in Deception Island. And such an amazing case because it's so well verified, so widely viewed. Residents of multiple countries saw these objects. Again, these are scientists, trained weather observers, but even more astonishing is how they were able to verify the presence of these craft using scientific instrumentation that really revealed some incredible details about these UFOs. So yeah, this one is such an important case, really should be taught in history books, honestly. Deception Island got its name Deception because it looks like an island, but it's really an atoll. It has a watery center. It is one island in the group of South Shetland Islands located on the Antarctic Peninsula, which is just south of South America. Well, not just south, some distance. But it is also the location of one of the most remarkable series of UFO encounters in this history of encounters, not only in the Antarctic, but really in the world. At the time of this wave, from June to July of 1965, 3 nations were maintaining research stations on the island, including the English base Bravo at Caleta Balaneros, the Chilean base Pedro Aguirre Cerda at Caleta Pendulum, and the Argentinian base at May Bay. And the first of what would be at least a dozen sightings occurred at 5:45 on June 2, 1965, when 5 witnesses at the English base Bravo saw a brilliantly lit, fast-moving, silent object maneuver across the sky in a zigzag fashion, accelerating, decelerating, hovering, but moving generally towards the east. The witnesses said it would flare red, green, and yellow as it performed these fantastic maneuvers, a pattern which would be repeated on several sightings soon to occur. It was one day later at almost exactly the same time, 5:30 p.m., June 3, 1965, when 2 officers stationed at Orcadas observed a round white object moving at high velocity in a parabola across the sky, disappearing after about 15 seconds of observation. Day after day, sightings. 4 days later, at 5:50 p.m., June 7, 1965, meteorologist Jorge Stanich was performing routine observations at the Argentinian base at May Bay when he noticed a bright yellow light low on the horizon. He estimates it was just over 1 mile away and about 100 to 150 feet in diameter. It was only in view for about 5 seconds when it disappeared. But just 1 day later, less, it was the next morning at 2:20 a.m., June 8, 1965, that he saw the same or similar object again, near the same area but closer, this time about 3/4 a mile away. He estimates that this object was about 50 to 65 feet in diameter. So 2 minutes after it disappeared into the clouds, he heard what he described as a, quote, grave sound, which was apparently unusual, and he mentioned it because he felt it might possibly be connected in some way to the encounter, though of course this was never confirmed. The wave wasn't over yet. 11 days later at 2:20 p.m. on June 18, 9 Air Force officers at the Chilean base at Caleta Pendulum saw a glowing solid object zigzagging across the sky for some 25 minutes. They described its appearance as being very much like a large star, white with orange hues. Clearly not a star if it's zigzagging. And there's some reports that there were other sightings on the 19th and the 22nd. But really it was some 2 weeks later at 7:15 p.m., July 2nd, 1965, when 5 garrison officers at English base Bravo were doing routine weather observations, and they said that they saw a light hovering, accelerating, zigzagging for a period of a full 15 to 20 minutes. Again, during this time, this object would change colors, turning green, red, and yellow. It was the very next day at 5:03 p.m., July 3, 1965, when 2 weather observers, Jose Jeriak and Jose Mazzucchelli, were at the Argentinian base on Lori Island when they observed a blue-white object, which they said was brighter than the brightest star, and it moved in a parabola from east to west. But most interesting was that during this time, their variometers, which measure magnetic fields, showed a sudden and strong disturbance, which coincided with the appearance and movement of this object. And it was just 2 hours and 20 minutes later at 7:20 p.m. that 9 garrison officers at the Chilean base on Deception Island described their sighting of a glowing solid object, which maneuvered overhead for a full 20 minutes. Again, it also changed in color from green to yellow and orange. It moved in a straight line, oscillating slightly, but did hover momentarily. They were able to view it using binoculars. They tracked it with a theodolite instrument and on magnetic instruments. The commander of the base, Don Maris Juan Barrera, said, and I quote, "What we observed was no hallucination or collective psychosis. It was not a star, for it had a very rapid and continuous movement. As far as I'm concerned, it is a celestial object that I am unable to identify. That it could be an aircraft constructed on this Earth, I do not believe possible." But what's most interesting about this is a magnetic field was detected coming from this object, and it was a huge magnetic field. Adjusting for its distance, they measured this magnetic field at some 49 million Ersteds. Now this is really a high magnetic field, because the highest artificially produced magnetic field is 20 Teslas, and 1 Tesla equals somewhere between 4,000 or 10,000 Ersteds. So yeah, clearly this object was producing an enormous magnetic field. Just 2 minutes later after this sighting, 17 officers at the Argentinian base on Deception Island described their sighting of a large circular object, solid, with a red center and edges that appeared to flare in different colors: yellow, green, orange, blue, and white. They watched as it moved in a zigzag pattern, hovered, accelerated sharply, reversing directions, and performing all kinds of movements for a period of 1 hour and 2 minutes. Now, some of the officers said that they were able to take photographs of this object as it maneuvered overhead. Later, the Secretary of the Argentinian Navy released a statement saying in part that the object was, quote, "a giant lens-shaped flying object, solid in appearance." They estimated its altitude was about 15,000 feet. Professor Charles Maney calls the July 3rd sightings, quote, "one of the most significant sightings of an unidentified flying object," because, as he says, this sighting is notable because it was observed by scientists and Navy personnel of 3 countries by a total of 31 persons. But the wave wasn't over yet. 4 days later, at 8:55 a.m., July 7, 1965, personnel at Gable Island saw a circular, bright silver object which remained stationary overhead for 2 or 3 minutes, then moved off to the east over Beagle Canal, actually sending down a brilliant beam of light into the water, piercing right through a cloud layer. The last and final sighting of this month-long wave occurred on July 8, 1965, when another object was seen, again performing fantastic maneuvers, again flashing multicolored lights in the same manner, and again described as zigzagging, just like all the previous sightings. And apparently the sightings at that point came to an end, or they were no longer being reported. Amazing. I mean, that is absolutely undeniable when you have that many witnesses over that widespread of an area over so many days seeing UFOs and verifying them with scientific equipment. You'd be a fool to deny that something is going on. I think that case is, again, clearly a display. The UFOs are making it very aware to everyone there that they know what's going on at Deception Island. So one of the most important cases, I think, really, in UFO history. And here's another pretty interesting case. This one is quite brief, but very unusual. Can't say I've heard of any case quite like this one, which I call the buzzing cloud. This occurred on May 22nd, 1966, at Mount Gaudry on Adelaide Island in the Antarctic. It was early in the morning on May 22nd, 1966, as two members of a British Antarctica survey team, both of them were meteorologists stationed at Mount Gaudry, they became witness to a very unusual UFO display in the Antarctic skies. It began when they noticed a strange-looking, very dense cloud in the southern sky. It not only looked strange, it was moving in a weird way, rising vertically at an estimated speed of about 10 feet per second. They estimated it was somewhere between 500 to 800 feet high and about 100 feet in diameter. And as they watched this cloud, it repeatedly expanded and contracted. But even more strange was that it was emitting a buzzing sound, which they said sounded like a swarm of bees. Now the biggest shock came when this cloud emitted a thick black ray at 45-degree angle down to the ground. They also noticed a secondary ray visible next to the larger one. Where the beam hit the ground, the witnesses were amazed to see what looked like a small snow devil. They quickly snapped a photograph. The entire event lasted some 45 minutes, at which point this weird cloud dissolved. The witnesses did report this event in their meteorological report and also to the U.S. Air Force, but never received any response. And an amazing case because, well, you can see for yourself. It's just unique and unusual. Certainly an interesting case, as is this next one, which I call UFO over volcanic eruption. This occurred on December 4, 1967 at Deception Island. And yeah, if you look that up, you will see that yes, a volcanic eruption did occur there. There are photographs. This case is quite brief, but important because it involves apparent photographic evidence of a UFO. Now, Deception Island is volcanically active, and when earthquakes were detected in this area in April of 1967, it became clear that there could be an eruption. Sure enough, some months later, on December 4, 1967, the active volcano on Deception Island erupted. It actually opened up new vents along a miles-long fissure on the north part of the caldera, quickly forming a new island on the western side of Telephone Bay. There, of course, was an emergency evacuation of the personnel stationed there at that time, which included 13 people from the Chilean base, 14 from the Argentinian base, and 8 from the British base. There was no apparent lava flow, but the eruption was severe enough to demolish both the British and Chilean stations, which led to the island being completely abandoned for a number of years. Now, while films and photos were taken of this eruption, as you can see, there is only one photo, again, which you can see here, which shows what appears to be a classic flying saucer hovering over the eruption in progress. I wish there was more information about this photograph, but alas, none has been forthcoming. Perhaps it's been covered up. Hard to say for sure, but it's certainly an interesting photograph. A pretty interesting case, and like all these cases, I just know there's more information out there about it. But with this brutal cover-up going on, and our government's spending an enormous amount of time, money, and energy to suppress UFO information, it's very difficult to verify a lot of these events. Did the best I can, and I think we do have some good information on a lot of these cases. But if it ever involves hardware or photographs or anything that absolutely confirms the presence of UFOs, our governments almost always step in to cover it up. Which may be what's happening in this next case, which is of somewhat dubious authenticity. I include it because I'm sure events like this do happen. I call this one Antarctic UFO crash, which allegedly occurred in October of 1982. Again, you'll have to take this one with a little bit of salt because I just don't know if this is well verified enough to say that we can absolutely conclude it did happen, but you can decide yourself. I found this case in the UFO News Clipping Service, and again, its authenticity may be somewhat dubious. I present it here for what it's worth, but it comes from an article published in The Sun, which is kind of a tabloid newspaper, was written in an article by Lewis Clifford under the title, Scientists Discover Crashed UFO in Antarctica with 5 Dead Aliens on Board. So this is the only source I could find. Again, please take it with a pinch of salt. The account allegedly comes from an anonymous physicist who in the summer of 1982 was part of an Arctic expedition search for meteorites. This much is very credible, as the Antarctic is very well known as being a treasure trove of meteorites, with thousands being recovered there. But per the physicist, it was during this expedition that they came upon the charred and shattered chunks of an apparent spacecraft that were scattered over a mile-long area. It appeared to them that this craft had struck a column of ice in a glancing blow, then skipped end over end, breaking apart and tossing the contents over a wide area. The physicist is quoted as saying, "A couple of the aliens were badly torn up, but the other 3 bodies are in good shape and are perfectly preserved by the ice." Per this witness, the 5 occupants were all males with unusually large heads, quote, 3 times the size you would expect, but were otherwise surprisingly human-like. He said that they had Asian-looking eyes, slightly pointed ears, just 2 nostril holes for a nose, a normal mouth filled with about 32 teeth. The bodies averaged 4 feet tall, slender with normal human anatomy, except for a bluish tint to the skin, though it was unclear to the physicist whether this color was due to the bodies being frozen for an extended period of time or was their actual complexion. The physicist did say that one of the beings appeared to have what looked like acne on his face. So while this discovery was made by an American team, apparently scientists from several nations became involved in the investigation, which turned the case reportedly into a political hot potato due to the fact of the Antarctic Treaty of 1959. I suspect that the vast majority of UFO crash retrieval cases are covered up to a point that we hear nothing about them. So the some 100, 200 cases that we do know about are surely only the tip of the iceberg. Now, let's move to the next case, which is again somewhat brief, and I don't know, you can make up your own mind about it. I call this one, They're Doing the Strangest Thing. This occurred somewhere around 1983 in the Transantarctic Mountains. This case does come from Linda Moulton Howe, who interviewed the witness firsthand, but it's a pretty controversial case. Some of his claims are a little different, I'll put it that way. So again, you can make up your own mind about it. Again, this case comes from researcher Linda Moulton Howe. She claims to have interviewed a gentleman using the pseudonym Brian, who said that he was stationed in McMurdo for a number of years. He told her that in 1983, the exact date was not given, he was on a squadron mission in the Transantarctic Mountains when he and the whole crew said that they saw a whole bunch of round, silver, darting objects. He told her, quote, they were doing the strangest thing. They were going to this peak in a group, and then they'd all take off. He told her this happened over and over again. And he told her quite a few other things, that on one occasion during another mission, he and his crew observed a strange opening in the pack ice, at which time they detected a magnetic field. Upon returning to the base, they were instructed never to talk about what they had seen. He told her many other strange goings-on, including the apparent disappearance of a group of scientists, the possibility of a secret base. Linda revealed all of this in an episode of Ancient Aliens on the History Channel, and of course in other interviews on various podcasts. I'd suggest going there if you'd like to learn more information about it. Some have been skeptical of these claims, but yeah, take a look. It's certainly interesting because again it fits in with the other reports we are getting from this area, at least to some extent. Perhaps one day that witness will step forward and we can learn more information, but certainly an interesting event, and it absolutely does fit in with all the other cases we're hearing about going on in Antarctica. Now let's move to our last case of this compilation. This one is pretty well verified and super interesting, which I call an enormous circle of light. This occurred in April of 1991 at the General San Martin base. And a super interesting case. The witness in this final case is Miguel Amaya, a non-commissioned Argentinian Air Force officer at the Resistencia Airport. His specialty is meteorology, with a subspecialty as a meteorological observer. He says it was in April 1991, the beginning of the long polar night. He was based at the General San Martin base with 20 men, all scientists and military personnel. It had been snowing for 6 or 7 days, was just below 0 degrees. It was around 1:15 a.m. He was in the meteorological station when the phone rang. This is the only phone that connected the station to the main base. And on the other line was an engineer who wanted to know if the radio operators had their equipment connected to transmit to the mainland. Now, it was late, and Miguel replied that he was the only one awake. So the engineer hung up without further comment, which Miguel thought was a little strange. Later that evening, around 5 p.m., Miguel actually asked the engineer why he had called, and as Miguel says, he looked at me with a face that seemed to not know what to answer. Now silence reigned in the room, and the engineer finally said that at the time of the call, their rheometer, a radio receiver which measures how much the ionosphere absorbs radio waves, had begun to record unusual measurements. And it was happening at weird, precise 15-minute intervals. These measurements indicated a very large energy source overhead. So finally they went outside, expecting to see something, a UFO, but nothing was visible. And after about 4.5 hours, the signals stopped. Just hours later, around 10 p.m., Miguel returned to the meteorological station. One of the men came to pick up his coat and said he was going to bed as he had stayed up all night due to the strange signals received earlier. So he left the station. 5 minutes passed and the phone rang. And it was the same guy who had just been there, and he told Miguel to come to the lab immediately. So Miguel arrived at the lab, and the man told him an incredible story. As Miguel says, "When I arrived, I noticed that he was very nervous and in a hurry to tell me that when he left my office and walked about 15 meters from the main house, he needed to look up at the sky. Even though it was still snowing and the clouds were low, he noticed an enormous circle of light pass over the base, very attenuated by the cloudiness, but still noticeable, and it headed towards the sea very slowly without any noise." So clearly a massive UFO. Really incredible. Another case that doesn't rely solely on eyewitness testimony, but involves scientific instrumentation verifying that something very unusual is going on in this area. Again, 1 or 2 cases would be easy to dismiss, 4 or 5, but no, we have a dozen. And again, just the tip of the iceberg. And I think the use of that term is particularly appropriate considering this is Antarctica. But seriously, 12 cases, we know that there's a lot more going on there. Such a shame that we have to deal with this stupid cover-up. I'm done with it. I think it's time for everyone to just stand up and say enough is enough. Don't know if that'll do it. I think our governments are going to go to their grave, kicking and screaming, fighting all the way, and will never be fully truthful and transparent with this subject. Certainly not voluntarily. But we'll see how this all rolls out as the years move forward. Meanwhile, I think we can say we have enough cases to conclude definitively that UFOs have been seen over Antarctica and do show an interest there. To deny these cases would be wholly unscientific, with photographic evidence, with multiple eyewitness testimonies, with cases stretching back decades. Clearly, UFOs are being seen there. So that's it for today. Thank you guys so much. I truly appreciate you tuning in each week and listening to the information that I work so hard to bring to you. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And until next week, keep asking those hard questions, keep searching for answers, keep having fun, and I will see you next time. Bye for now.